It's human nature to start things, but it takes maturity to see them through. And I believe it's better to create at all than not.
Hey, Phil.
So,
are you forgetting something?
If you spent countless nights lying awake, doubting yourself,
I'm gonna climb a mountain. Today, I'm in the Adirondacks, and we are going to summit one of its most famous mountains. I'm going to climb New York's tallest mount, Mount Marcy.
This isn't Marcy.
No.
How long does Marcy take?
13. Today, we're in the Adirondacks for another mountain, Crane, which should take about 3. But despite the differences in time, it's still just as challenging with peak for novices like myself. And yes, if you're wondering, I'm literally climbing a mountain to run away from my film school thesis, which was never finished. Since we have a journey ahead of us and you're still watching, I guess I can explain on why I've given up on my film. It all started in my senior year of film school, when a highly respected professor shared a story with my class. At the end of the year, a showcase is held. All soon-to-be graduating seniors exhibit their thesis films. Not only do they show off the efforts of the entire academic year, but hopefully, they also display every ounce of filmmaking ability they've amassed and developed throughout their 4 years of film school. The legend goes, during one of these showcases, this professor noticed a man in the back of the audience. He couldn't figure out whose parent he was, but thought nothing of it. But strangely, it didn't seem to matter, as this man showed up the next year, and the next, and every year after. It wasn't until he went to the showcase at a competing film school that he started to theorize who he was, because as you guessed it, he was there too, like always, in the back of the crowd, silently studying the student films. When an exceptional movie was presented, this mysterious stranger without fail tracked down the student at the end of the showcase. Not every graduating class had someone lucky enough to catch his interest, but this mysterious stranger was clearly hunting for the most promising young filmmakers. A brief greeting, presentation of a card, and just like that, he was gone. Years later, my professor witnessed this very routine on one of his students, a bright and very trusted pupil of his. Without telling much, the most the student could say was this man represented a Hollywood studio. But the man's identity isn't important. What matters is who he represents and what doors they can open. Whether you choose to believe this is up to you. But I take this tale as gospel. So to recap, there is a Hollywood talent scout whose attention I'm hoping to capture. At this point in film school, my confidence is at an all-time high after multiple successful projects, all culminating into the makings of my biggest gamble. My film named Continuum featured more depth than anything I'd ever written, a production that would require more coordination than anything before, and a set that would demand the most out of my... Two of the crew members, let's call them Vincent and Jules, they had graciously agreed to drive in from out of town.
I got a tinkle. You serious?
Nice. Yeah, that was a rough first 24 hours. It didn't get any better, but at least we did this.
Camera's fine.
No, I will not elaborate.
Phil heard the news the week before the shoot. He didn't want the crew to know. Not only so they wouldn't be distracted, but so they wouldn't question his judgment. The crew knew he had a broken back, which is a story for a different video. But it provided us a convenient enough excuse. Still, as shooting began, it became clear that this wasn't enough. He asked me not to tell anyone.
Everyone who's ever made a film before knows the first assembly cut of a film is bad. It's always bad, but typically you can see the kernel of a good idea, the concept that was interesting enough to try and make it into a film. This was just bad. Way worse than any first cut I've ever made, enough to signal the magical powers of editing. Couldn't change the truth that what we filmed was crap. But I wasn't gonna just give up here. Rewrites and reshoots happen, and while the first shoot was rough, I was still in the good graces of my cast and crew that they were willing to shoot again. Duncan and I immediately got back to the drawing board, restructuring a single scene to make the story still work. Potential was still on the horizon, and as filmmakers, we're no stranger to doing things again to get it right. It was just a matter of scheduling the shoot, which is an art of conferring with the cast and crew to find the common chunk of time they'd all be available. We all agreed on March. March of 2020. So the shoot never happens because we're sent home and can't come back to campus. I submit a carcass of what I envisioned my thesis to be. So you know how this story ends. But there's still something I haven't told you. I get a call from my dad. A no bullshit kind of guy. But he can barely speak as he says hello. It's Mom. I can hear his words, but I don't focus on what he's saying. It's as cliche as it is in every scene about someone being told they're dying. Because she was. She has breast cancer. Like most people, I grew up believing my dad was the toughest guy on the planet. Without being a mechanic, plumber, or construction worker, he still taught me that with intelligence and bravery, anything could be fixed. In 2012, Hurricane Sandy hit the eastern seaboard. Upon its arrival, it knocked out electricity, cell towers, and affected every imaginable piece of infrastructure. My local power company expected the soonest they'd be able to come to our street was 3 weeks. My father couldn't help but notice a slight tear in one of the transformer wires. On a hunch, wearing an old leather jacket, he grabbed a roll of electric tape and borrowed a neighbor's ladder. Now, of course, many of the neighbors warned the danger wasn't worth it, but they anxiously watched him perform this improvised surgery and celebrated when the lights came back on. This story of a determined man cautiously facing peril in the interest of his family's well-being encapsulates my father in a nutshell. So hear me clearly when I tell you this idea of my father was shattered during my mother's cancer journey, because the rapid metastasis of an odd cell was something he couldn't fix with his hands. For the first time in his life, he had no say, no impact, and no ability to gauge the severity of a problem affecting someone he loved. But his vulnerability was something I alone experienced, because he understood that when someone is weak, they look to who they trust and love most to guide them, to set an emotional precedent. He understood that whether he saw it or not, my mom looked to him to determine if she would cry or continue braving the storm. He went to every meeting, every consult, every checkup next to her. As the pandemic overwhelmed the medical industry, the clinics they had begun treatments at or halting all care due to COVID. How do you pause chemotherapy? Finding this unacceptable, my father searched for a care center that remained open, even if it meant driving for hours. Half their week was spent in their car, so I stepped up to the plate. I took care of all their chores. Every day when they'd come home, exhausted but still braving a weak smile, I made sure they never had to raise a finger. Meals waiting for them in the morning, noon, and night. Not a dish left to be washed, groceries purchased, trash taken out, etc. This went on for months. And while these duties were physically exhausting, this wasn't the hardest part. No. The hardest part was the feeling of uneasiness. First the diagnosis, then finding clinics, biopsies, treatments, chemotherapy, surgeries. As soon as I had stomached the uneasiness of one factor, another and another and another would spring up. It was clear that my labor and my good intentions, while appreciated, were not sufficient in keeping them at ease. One night, my dad snuck into my room, and he asked me if I was afraid. It didn't matter that he was smiling, because I could see it in his eyes. He was asking me, like my mother would ask him, to see how he'd carry on for that night. And so, like a good son, I lied. And then he asked another night and another night. This back and forth didn't happen every night, but that's what made it so difficult. It meant that every day, the stoicism I had to display was constant. In my parents' eyes, I believed all was well, and while this certainly wasn't great, cancer was no match for us three. And so, like clockwork, he'd ask me the same question, and I'd lie to him just the same way. And every time we did this, his shoulders would drop, and he'd later find a way for my mom to laugh. This was my life during Continuum. I didn't give a damn about the movie. This is why I've been running. In the first episode, I stressed the importance of finishing what we start, seeing our pursuits to the end. Duncan asked, and we deeply considered resurrecting Continuum, but ultimately, I said no. While my film may not be salvageable, I still needed to close that chapter of my life, hence this video. I had the opportunity to speak with an executive for a multinational branding agency. I excitedly shared with him all that Duncan and I managed to accomplish for our company, and he gave me some advice. Know when to walk away. He said it because our optimism can be found in both stories of success and in failure. Sometimes there are no definitive endings to our pursuits. While the fate of Ranger Daze is uncharted, I can confidently say that Continuum is a perfect example of knowing when to call it. Sometimes you can do your best and yet still fail. And that's okay. Because you didn't fail for a lack of trying, but because sometimes that's just what happens. While my film and my career didn't have the launch that I hoped for, my mom and her cancer is in remission. And if I'd have to make that choice again, I'd do it the same in an instant. Thanks for watching. As you can guess, I didn't document myself during this brutal chapter of personal turmoil. So in writing this episode, I brilliantly thought, what better way to illustrate this specific trial of tribulation than by literally climbing a mountain.